Troy Home GRI, Geospatial Research Institute. Welcome to the GRI for our seminar, monthly seminar. We have with us Cristina Banks-Leite.
Well done.
Yeah. My Portuguese is going to be tested. It's fantastic to have you here. I've known Chris for quite a while, or known of Chris for quite a while. Which way round is it? We're really pleased to have her here. She is a reader, I think I read this now, reader in Department of Life Sciences at Imperial College London. And she investigates the causes and consequences of species turnover and extinction in fragmented landscapes of tropical regions, but I think also very relevant to some of the situations in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Your research has proposed a threshold of 30% forest cover for the effective restoration of Brazilian Atlantic forest, which I think I've taken it down, was on that map on the screen before. And the results of which provided subsidies for the implementation of 2 environmental resolutions and a federal decree in Brazil. So that's impact right there. And you've also done work in Costa Rica, protecting one of the last regions of primary forest, born in Sao Paulo. Received your degree from Universidade de Sao Paulo.
Well,
Could that be do Sao Paulo?
No, de São Paulo.
Okay. And you were later awarded a postdoctoral fellowship to conduct your research at Imperial College, and obviously was so successful that you continued there in your academic career. And you have won multiple awards. You served as a board member for the Council of International Ecological Societies, editorial boards for leading journals and funding agencies. And perhaps most importantly, you have 2 small children and are a strong advocate for minorities in science. And so it is a real honor to welcome you here to present this meeting, to this seminar to us. And I'll stop talking. I think we're on time now.
Yes, perfect.
Perfect timing. So welcome everyone online as well. I know there's a lot of interest in this talk because of this is a real question we are asking here in New Zealand. So Chris, over to you. Hope I did you justice in the introduction.
Thank you very much, Matt. And thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk today. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. So I'm going to be talking about some of the things that Matt mentioned in my introduction. Hang on, let me see how this is going to work. So I'm going to be talking about not going to be talking about anything but the maybe clicking.
There you go.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to be talking about how much habitat is enough to protect biodiversity, but also how much habitat do we need in the world. And start with this Guardian news piece of article when they showed that COP15 in 2022, there was this agreement to halve biodiversity by 2030. And the idea was to set up this 30 by 30 scheme or initiative where we would be preserving or conserving and protecting 30% of sea and land by 2030. So this is the moment where they voted. Everyone was really happy about it. And, this is a really big deal because it's really difficult to know, to protect biodiversity. It doesn't have as much influence, higher up in government as climate change has at the moment. But, and this is obviously something that is, it's going to be very important to help protect biodiversity, but to make sure that this 30 by 30 initiative is successful, we need to make sure that it needs to be simple. People need to understand what it is. It needs to be practical, and it needs to be effective at conserving biodiversity. So we can definitely say that it is simple So, you know, anyone can understand that, you know, let's preserve 30% of area by 2030. That's, you know, that's pretty easy to understand. It is practical. Perhaps it is a little bit, it may be a bit complicated for some countries, depending on the level of conservation they have at the moment. But I'll show you an example later on of what we did in Brazil. And, you know, it can be practical, but we don't know whether it is effective or not. So what is the evidence that these guys had to suggest this 30 by 30? So I went back into the paper, which is the main paper that was used for suggesting this 30% by 2030, which is this global deal for nature. This is a review in Science Advances. And when I looked at the paper first, I thought, well, you know, maybe they've done some sort of review to see, you know, and found that we, you know, with 30% of area preserved, we would be able to help biodiversity loss. That's kind of like, you know, the expectation that you'd get from this paper. But all this paper had was one line where they say, we support calls to conserve at least 30% of the Earth's surface by 2030. I think, oh, that's interesting. So what's is this citation number 40? Maybe that is the actual review. Well, citation number 40 is a one-page editorial in Science by these two authors, which are also authors in the other paper, where we have this also, you know, one sentence saying, we encourage governments to set minimum targets of 30% oceans and land protected by 2030, with a focus on areas of high biodiversity and productivity, with an aim to secure 50% by 2050. I think this 50 by 50 got kind of lost along the way. But this is, you know, I was a bit surprised, not amazingly surprised, that you know, something so important as the 30 by 30, that's, you know, all governments across the world are kind of engaging on it. It comes from very, very weak evidence that it's actually going to be effective to halt biodiversity loss. So, so this is where, with that in mind, today, what I'm going to be talking about is, so I'm going to start with the study case where we studied the Atlantic forests of Brazil, where we identified how much habitat was enough and where we implemented this into policy. Then I'm going to talk a bit about why can't we just extrapolate those results to the whole world? Why can't we have it just so, you know, one size fits all? And then I'm going to finish by showing some recent results that we've got about how much habitat do we actually need across the world. So starting with the study case, at this part here, I'm also going to go a little bit more into detail of how we measure these thresholds of biodiversity responses to habitat loss. So, and I should start by saying that, so New Zealand, I've been to New Zealand quite a few times. It is definitely one of the prettiest, if not the prettiest country I've ever been. But this is the Atlantic forest of Brazil. It's also very pretty. It's not far off. And it's a bit warm, I've got to say. So Brazil's often on the news for its very high rate of deforestation. But what's easy to forget is that Brazil has actually one of the most advanced and one of the best legislation on conservation in the world. So Brazil, the Forest Code was first kind of put into legislation, I think it was in the 60s. And it has changed in many different ways since then. But the main kind of, the main part of it hasn't, which is, so in Brazil, landholders need to preserve part of their land as a set aside for native habitats. So in the Amazon, that's 80%. So if you've got a farm of 100 hectares, 80% of your farm, so 80 hectares is going to have to be Amazon native forest, and then you can only develop 20%. So then you think, well, where's all this deforestation coming from? Well, there's a lot of illegal deforestation. The rest of Brazil, it's 20%. So so if you've got a farm of 100 hectares, then 20% of your farm needs to be native forest, native habitat, and the rest you can develop. So these numbers are all kind of, nice, but one of the questions we also had was, to which extent is this going to be enough to preserve biodiversity in Brazil? Is 20% enough for the Atlantic forest? So that at the time when those numbers were written into law, nobody really knew. So let me first, before I start explaining a bit more about our study, let me first give you an idea of what the Atlantic forest is. So the Atlantic forest was once the second largest tropical forest within South America, within the Americas. And it used to occur across all this area here in kind of light gray. And it was a very lush forest. So it's a bit shorter stature compared to the Amazon forest, but it's very structured, lots of bromeliads, lots of orchids. It's absolutely outstanding forest, absolutely gorgeous. It's also an area with very high levels of endemism. So incredibly high numbers of plants and birds and mammals, amphibians, and etc., which only occur there. So the Atlantic forest has been, it's one of the first areas to be colonized by European settlers. So it has been very heavily modified. So it's been reduced to kind of like these dots that you can see. So the exact amount left depends on the paper that you read, but let's, it's about 16%, which and a lot of what is left is also very fragmented. So the very small patches, they're usually secondary forests and so forth. So in this area as well, we have about 130 million people living there. So whatever, you're going to do there to preserve or to restore this area, it needs to be very carefully considered because it's the powerhouse of Brazil. It's where most of the economic development comes from. So that's where you get a lot of all of the farms and so if you're going to make space for nature, you have to make sure that it's going to be effective and it's not going to cost a lot to the public. So we had quite a large study in this area of the Atlantic forest around São Paulo, where we studied about 79 sites, and we used mist nets to capture birds. We used these massive buckets, pitfall traps, to capture mammals and amphibians. And in total, we had about 25,000 captures of these many species of birds, mammals, and amphibians, and it was quite a long study, involved hundreds of people. And most of these animals were recaptured afterwards, so we could, in terms of recaptures, we have even higher numbers than that. So we had this study was designed to kind of answer questions about how does habitat fragmentation impact species, and how does the aspects of the landscape impact these communities. But when we got to the end of this project, we thought, okay, so maybe with this data we can ask really how much habitat do we need to protect biodiversity in the Atlantic forest, and is it the 20% enough to protect? So first, I would just want to talk a little bit about how to measure habitat, because it sounds like a trivial question, but it really isn't. And so by training, I'm a landscape ecologist, which means that we spend quite a lot of time looking at these sorts of maps where you paint the forest in green and you paint the non-forest in white, and then you think, okay, so how am I going to measure, the patch, a forest patch, or the size and connectivity and all of these sorts of things. So traditionally, people measure habitat by looking at the patch of forest or the forest fragment as if it was an island. So for instance, if we're looking at this patch of forest here, yeah, you can, this is going to be, let's say, 3 hectares. Sure, you can just measure it, and it would be kind of easy to measure the distance to the nearest forest and so forth. So that's kind of like what we think in our, when we think of something simple. The problem is different people consider the patch in different ways. So for instance, one of my colleagues would have considered this patch here, which is one of the patches that we studied, as 2 different patches connected by a corridor. So that was, that's one way of seeing it. To me, it was all the same patch, but then you have to think, okay, so how do you measure the size of a patch if you have a road? So is the road really dividing 2 different patches, or is the road just kind of like, all the animals can cross? So these are kind of arbitrary decisions that you have to make at every point. And it seems simple when someone says, oh, we need 100 hectares, but it's not really that simple when you're there in the forest looking to see, okay, so what is this 100 hectares? The other issue as well is that just the size of the fragment is not enough to tell you whether that patch is going to be it's going to have a lot of species or not, because again, this patch here that might have 150 hectares, and it's really close to all of this forest, right? But that patch over there also has 150 hectares, and doesn't have that much forest around, which means that it has fewer sources of species coming from the nearby forest. So, and how do you measure that? It's really hard to measure how much, to measure connectivity. And then now you've got 2 different measures: patch size, connectivity. Then you might want to think, oh, a patch may be more round, or there's a more kind of linear. So it's a really complicated question, which there is a much simpler answer, which is often to just measure the proportion of habitat around where you are, right? So for instance, I've sampled this patch here, and we've put our line of mist nets here and a line of pitfall traps. And then you can just do a radius around the sampling point, and basically measure the number of pixels of forest, the number of pixels of non-forest, and that's it. So basically, you've got the proportion of habitat that you've got there. The exact radius really matters, but that's something that you can easily measure. All the radius that that you'd like, and then you just choose the one that it's the best one. And this gets, it gets around all of those issues of, what is considered a patch, what it's not, and the connectivity. Because here you're going to have, let's say, 80% forest cover. Here you're going to have 40% forest cover, and then it's something that everyone can agree on. Nobody's is going to doubt that, and it's also something that it's a lot easier for it's a lot easier to measure and so forth. So that's where we went with. And so our radius, so we decided on a radius of 800 meters, which gave us an area of about 200 hectares. And across these 79 landscapes or areas, we had a variation of 5% to 100% forest cover. Now, the other issue, which is also incredibly complicated, much more complicated than people think, is how do you measure biodiversity? So some people, a lot of people just measure species richness, which is the number of species. But I have a real issue with species richness, and this photo shows it very well. So it may as well be that this forest here has the same number of species than this coral reef here, but they're completely different species, right? But if here you say, well, we've got 100 here and 100 here, like what can you say about it? And it's very interestingly enough, in fragmented landscapes, we also have exactly the same trend. we have a very significant change in the identity of the species without necessarily much change in the numbers of species. So really what we need is a measure of community composition, which takes into account changes in the number of species and changes in the identity of these species. So a lot of these measures are a little bit more complicated to interpret and a little bit more complicated to run, but not significantly so. But what we decided to use is what we called community integrity, which is kind of like the first step that you do when you're analyzing community composition, which is basically just analyze use the similarity index that works best for your data. In our case was the Sorensen, and we measure the similarity in species composition between our fragments and the pristine areas. So we would know exactly how different they were. So then we analyze the data for all the three groups and for vertebrates together, and what we found was incredibly consistent responses across all these groups. So basically the integrity, the community integrity, didn't change much all the way into 30%, roughly 30%, and then it declined steeply. So what this means is that it's not that we're not losing species or gaining species. So it was just, the exact species that are there may be changing a bit, but not a lot. So as you can see, there's still 75% of similarity, 60% of similarity, and so forth. But something happens here at around 30%, where this similarity then suddenly starts declining very rapidly. And so one of the things that then we wondered, okay, so this inflection point is at about 30%, but what you can see is that at 30% here, it's just, things are just starting to change. So why not 40%? Why not 45%? Why not kind of just set a slightly higher target for how much forest we need to tell politicians about it, or policymakers about it. The thing is that we also measure the costs of such a policy. So as I was saying before, the Atlantic forest is about 16%. So as you can imagine, most of the areas are much below this 30% target. So we estimated how much it would cost to reforest these areas, right? So we had two different costs. So when you're doing reforestation, a lot of the time you first need to go and do some sort of active management. So you have to go and plant the seedlings and you have to water them. There is some level of care for the first 3 years, and that's expensive. And then after 3 years, you can kind of just let the plants grow. So if we divided the Atlantic forest in millions of little landscapes of 200 hectares and took the ones that already have 20% and brought them to 30% forest cover, so we reforest these areas back to 30% forest cover, it would cost about 0.009% of Brazil's GDP in the first 3 years, and then 0.003% in after that. So that's about $200 million. It's not a huge amount, and it's about 6.5% of what Brazil spent on agricultural subsidies. So it's something that you think, okay, so that's kind of reasonable, if we prioritize these landscapes first, and then we can move forward to the other ones. But you can see that if we decided to restore 35%, 40%, or 45%, the costs increase dramatically. So in the first 3 years, for instance, with more than triple the costs of restoration, if we decided to go for a more ambitious, more target. And really, obviously I would prefer 40%, 45, why not 50? Let's go for 70. But the costs are really dramatic. And then you really need to see to which extent that's going to be well accepted by public, and whether the government has the money for it, who's going to pay for it, really, isn't it? So, so when we published this paper, that was 2014. And at that time, Brazil was going through a very dramatic water drought. So the city of São Paulo, which has about 20 million people, a bit more than that, was, if I recall correctly, they had water twice a week. So my parents who lived there, they would only have water like Tuesdays and Saturdays. It was horrendous. Imagine a city with that many people, with just, you know, with that rationing of water. The reservoirs were down to like 1 or 2%. It was horrendous. So when this paper came out, there was this kind of clear acknowledgement from policymakers that something needed to be done, both to kind of preserve the watersheds but also to kind of help protect these areas with, you know, with the ongoing climate change. So these results made into 3 different pieces of legislation. So one of them was in São Paulo, so kind of defining offsetting standards. The other one was in the state of Rio de Janeiro, which was about protection of watersheds. And the final one was a national policy for native vegetation recovery, which was to define priority areas. This one, I don't know how far, what's going with it, because right after that, Bolsonaro came into power, and then things, I think, got a bit out of hand, but maybe they will come back now. So it was really interesting to see how, you know, to see how this play out. And it was, I think, one of the reasons why our paper made itself into, you know, to help public policy, was because it was simple and it was practical, and we showed, you know, that it would be effective for preserving biodiversity. So, moving on. So, you know, I've just been saying that, you know, like I started the talk with saying that, you know, that people are suggesting this 30 by 30, then criticizing it, and I was then showing that 30% is enough in the Atlantic forest. So you probably think, like, what, you know, what's going on here? Like, why can't we just use this? So why can't we just basically, you know, take this result and expand to the rest of the world, and you know, just assume that 30% is going to be enough? And at this part here, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what drives species responses to habitat change, because that is a super complicated question. So if we go back to this figure of what, you know, of the thresholds in the Atlantic forest. So why is it that we have this 30% in the Atlantic forest? So a lot of the time people thought, well, it's got something to do with this landscape, or, you know, something to do with the species. So what really drives it is the changes in the types of species that we get. So we divided the community of mammals, birds, and amphibians into 2 parts. So those that were forest specialists, so the species that you're more likely to see in the forest, and those that are disturbance adapted species. And what we found is that the 30% threshold really was associated with this kind of, you know, the change where the forest specialists stopped being the dominant part of the community, and the disturbance adapted species started becoming the most the dominant part of the community. So basically that's where you have, you know, you're losing quite a few species, you're also gaining quite a few species, hence why I don't like the whole business of species richness, because we've got this loss and gain of species going on at the same time. And this is what defines why we have this threshold at 30%. Amazing. The problem is, the proportion of forest specialists changes a lot across the world. So, so this is a paper that's in final review, kind of second or third review in global ecology and biogeography. Hopefully it'll be out, where this Ben House, former student of mine, he, I might have to go. Yeah. He used data from IUCN to look into the global distribution of forest specialists. And what we can see is that for amphibians and birds and mammals and not snakes, sorry, reptiles, that's the word. You can see that, you know, there are parts of the world where there is a much larger proportion of species. So for instance, for mammals, you can see that the tropics here, and just about all parts of the tropics, have a much higher proportion of forest species. So, you know, more than 50%. But then as you go further into towards the poles, then you get a much lower proportion of species. So this clearly shows that, you know, this suggests that though the kind of the threshold that we would get would be different in different parts of the world. And now I'm gonna just go a little bit about then kind of discussing what drives these species responses to habitat change, because this is important to understand why is it that we can't just use a one-size-fits-all. So in this paper here, this is an opinion piece where we were looking at evidence that there is to show of why, you know, some species are more sensitive to habitat change than others. So a lot of the literature, if you go into it, you're going to find that a lot of you know, most people think that it's just because of species traits. So some species have traits that make them more sensitive, or other species have traits that make them less sensitive, and that's because of it. Now, I disagree with it, and it may be controversial, but I think it's all to do with space, basically. There's very little to do with species traits, and very much to do with where those populations are located. So I'm going to go into some examples here of studies that we've done. So first I'm going to talk about a study that we did, was showing how past disturbances affect the way species respond to habitat change. And also how climate suitability also affects whether two different populations of the same species respond in different ways. Then I'm going to finish talking just a little bit about some of these results, which I'm not going to go too much into detail. So we also found that if you take two different populations of the same species, and you measure one population near the edge of their range, so this light blue area, and in the center of their range, they will respond to habitat loss in completely different ways. So often in the center of the species range, they can occur everywhere. They are not necessarily impacted by habitat loss, but when they occur near the edge of their range, they're super sensitive, and they respond very strongly to habitat changes. So let's look at the first one. So the first, it's this paper where we looked into extinction filters. This is kind of like an old hypothesis that suggests that you know, past disturbance may have either driven some species to extinction before we even started studying them. So in some places you'd have fewer sensitive species because they've gone extinct, or maybe species just adapted through time. So so we looked at four different types of disturbances, and as you can see that some parts of the world are much more disturbed in general. So Canada, poor Canada, you know, it's not very good there. And you know, but Central America is also hit a lot by storms. Atlantic forest of Brazil has been deforested for a very long time. There's glaciation. New Zealand is not that happy either, neither is Australia. So you can see that you know, there's some parts of the world there is a much higher occurrence of these disturbances, but also multiple disturbances at the same time. And what we found is that these disturbances were somehow also kind of correlated with latitude. So here we looked at proportion of core species. So we're looking at edge effects as a measure of fragmentation. I'm not going to go into too much into detail about how we calculate it, especially because I wouldn't be able to tell you because it's a very complicated math. But basically, core species are the species that occur only in very large fragments, species that are very far from the edge of that fragment. And what you can see here is that across the world, for all these groups, the proportion of core species in a community is much larger in lower latitudes than it is at higher latitudes, and it's much larger as well in areas with low disturbance than in areas with high disturbance. And this suggests that really, you know, there's something going on in these areas that you're just constantly being hit by disturbances, glaciation, and etc., that makes those communities just, you know, more able to adapt to habitat change. And you can imagine, right? So if you've got a big glacier coming through and then the glacier retreats, then, you know, that's a whole new habitat that needs to be recolonized. So you can see how it's a different kind of place compared to the Amazon that's been like that for millions of years without much change. Moving on, so these are all very, very fresh from the oven sorts of results. So I've got a PhD student called Natasha Granville, who has an incredible ability to use R. And she put together 4 very large databases. So the breeding bird survey in the US, the Atlantic birds, which is a big database of Atlantic data sets from the Atlantic forest, BioFrag, which is a global database of fragmentation studies, and Predicts, which is a global database of habitat change studies. So altogether, there was about 6,700 sites, and we're talking about over 1,500 species of birds. And here we're really trying to look into interspecific variation. So these models control for a number of things, including kind of, you know, these different species. And what we're finding, which is also supported by literature, is that when the population occurs in an area where it's very close to its maximum temperature. So for instance, let's say, you know, you take an entire species that occurs from 0 degrees to 30 degrees. If you study this species in a place where the maximum temperature is 25 degrees, then this species will tend to, the occupancy will tend to increase with forest cover. So the species is a species that is sensitive to proportion of forest cover, and when it's deforested, then the species is very rare. Now, when you study the species in a place that it's 5 degrees and the maximum temperature of the species is 30, then the species actually prefers to be in areas that are a bit more deforested. This may also have to do with the fact that deforestation in itself increases temperature as well. So it's probably that it's this kind of this interaction of the microclimate outside the forest that will increase the temperature that, you know, drives this, because obviously if you're already very close to your maximum temperature limit and then you deforest, then that will bring you up to that. So this is to say that and also this suggests that with climate change things are going to get a little bit tougher. And just to finalize very quickly, so as I said before, we also found that species tend to be, so populations of the same species tend to be more sensitive to habitat loss near the edge of the range. And you know, you may think, well, this is all very complicated and it's really hard to put it together. And to be very frank, I don't really know how to put all of this stuff together that I've just mentioned before into one single framework that we can, you know, calculate, you know, with precision how communities or how species are going to be affected by habitat loss in different parts of the world. This is our first attempt at it, just using the concept of higher sensitivity near the range edge. So if you have you know, if you know the species range, and then you know that the species is going to be more sensitive near its range edge, if you know also where species occur in a fragmented area, and you know how they respond to that, you can put these two maps together to kind of get to an incidence map of, you know, how many species you'd expect at different parts, that it's much more precise than you'd get either just by, you know, putting like the stacking lots of range maps one on the top of each other, you know, to get macroecological species richness, or just thinking through how species respond to habitat loss without considering that in different parts of the country or you know the region you're going to have different responses. So it's kind of like, it's one of, I see this is kind of going a way forward to figure out how we can put these sorts of information together to predict where communities may be more sensitive or less sensitive to habitat changes in the face of climate change. It's not easy working with biodiversity. It's quite a lot of things at the same time. Right, so moving on to the last part. So how much habitat do we need then across the world? And again, I'm going to go back to the issue of latitude and disturbance. So for this one, we went back to using the PREDICTS database, which is as I said, a global database of fragmentation studies across the world. And there were about 79 studies. And we were looking for thresholds. So we were basically trying to identify what is the minimum habitat that we need in these different places. So we used the same approach as I mentioned before for the Atlantic forest. So we measured habitat amount, just the proportion of forest cover, and we measured the similarity in fragments compared to kind of like, you know, the pristine area. So we didn't find thresholds everywhere, because you wouldn't expect to find thresholds everywhere. And the yellow dots here are where we did find thresholds, and the open circles, it's where we didn't. So I think in total there were about 44, 45 studies where we found thresholds. In some cases, we're just kind of like a linear relationship or a non-significant relationship. And here they just jittered a bit to show that, you know, there was some overlap. And this is a database of, again, arthropods and vertebrates, but no plants. And one of the things that we noticed as well is that there are actually two different types of thresholds. So what I showed before in the Atlantic forest is this kind of shape. It's what we called the accelerating threshold. But actually, there is another type of threshold, which is this type of shape, which is what we call the decelerating threshold. And so this is something that we're still kind of trying to figure out, what's driving it and what's causing it and how they differ. But what we did find is that the decelerating threshold was always higher than the accelerating threshold. So we'd always have a threshold higher up and then another one. So this suggests actually that the process of biodiversity loss is, so you've got your full community in your pristine area, and then any type of disturbance will immediately lead to changes in the community, and it will immediately lead to losses in integrity, and then you get to kind of like a stable state, which is where you've got, you know, those species that are still able to handle a little bit of disturbance. You know, you've got your generalist species, you've got some of your disturbance specialist species, sort of thing. But then you reach another threshold where those species start getting lost. So all of those generalist species get lost. And then when you get to really 0% forest cover, that's when you get like almost nothing. That's when you start losing species richness as well. So there's the process of biodiversity loss is much more complex than we thought it was. And it involved this kind of stable state. And it may be that also when we're looking at reforesting areas, we may hit this and it may be hard to go back up again. And what we also found is that latitude and regional deforestation also impacts where these thresholds are. So what do I mean by regional deforestation? So it's, if we think about, you know, what we were showing with that paper of the extinction, sorry, no, let me go back, sorry, let me just very quickly show here. So so for instance, if we're thinking here about the Amazon, right? So there are some parts of the Amazon where you can see that there's not much deforestation at all. But if we are studying some of these parts here, which have already, like in the region itself has been deforested, you'd expect the community in the area already to be modified. So the regional deforestation is basically just the wider region where the study was conducted. And what we found was that for those accelerating thresholds, so if you have basically quite high areas of, you know, forest cover, well, let's say, well, this is deforestation. So if you have very low deforestation, the threshold is still going to be high, but then the lower that you go, then you've got the higher deforestation that you go, then your threshold will be then about 25% or lower. That's for the accelerating threshold. Now for the decelerating threshold, the regional deforestation doesn't matter as much. They're always quite high, and there is a bit more of an impact of latitude as well. There is a bit more of a difference of latitude. So it's interesting, for instance, that for in the equator at 0 degrees latitude, regardless of the regional deforestation, your threshold is always going to be very, very high, which is not necessarily good news. So, and this is kind of like our attempt at kind of extrapolating it across the world for the forests of the world, because it's much harder to model the non-forested parts and predict the position of the accelerating and decelerating threshold. So, yeah, so with that in mind, so going back to kind of the beginning of the talk, so 30 by 30 is definitely simple. It's definitely practical. It can be implemented, but it is unlikely really to be effective to preserve biodiversity worldwide, because what we found was that we need, you know, on average, at least 50%. So in a good chunk of the world, we're going to need much more than 30%. And then it's a matter of discussing the pros and cons. So is 30% still good enough? Maybe it is. It's going to be a difficult decision to be made. Species responses to habitat loss are not fixed, and they are incredibly complicated to be estimated because they are determined by climate, they're determined by biogeography, they're determined by the exact location where the species is, so the population is, sorry. So it is much harder than we think, but there is enough data out there that we can move on to measuring how much area we need at different places of the world, instead of just kind of advocating for one number, one rule of thumb for everyone. That's not, it's going to be, it might be too much for some people, it might be too not enough for others. So I will thank you so much for your attention. I'm gonna end with just kind of just gonna leave the papers that I reference and just some of the stuff that I've done. And if you want to hang on. No, doesn't work. Oh no, I can move that up. Amazing. And if you have any questions, I am happy to answer. Otherwise, you can email me as well. I'd be happy to speak to you. Thank you.
Yes.
That's all right.
Questions? Okay.
Published your research for the Atlantic forest showed these thresholds at about 30%. Were you still concerned about politicians taking that and saying, oh, okay, well, they would need to be 20%, got 30%, but also the Amazon doesn't need to be 80%.
It was a real concern because I mean, I spoke a lot to journalists, and every single one asked me that question. Oh, so does that mean that we can do that? So one of the things that I try to make quite clear is that this is a target for reforestation and not for deforestation. And the Amazon is a completely different system because, I mean, if we deforest, I mean, it's already, I don't know, close to 80%, I think now. But if we deforest it to 30%, it will become a savanna pretty quickly, right? So it's a completely different environment and system. So I try to make it clear that it's not a target for deforestation, because to be very honest, I don't think we can deforest. We can't afford to deforest, like for biodiversity. Like you can never replace a primary forest ever with anything. So I try to make that as clear as possible, and I think most people got it. I think, hopefully.
Other questions or online as well? Online. So you have been covered for pre-population, but do you have anything for marine habitat?
No, I don't have anything for marine habitats. So marine habitats are a bit more complicated, I think. They may not be more complicated, they're complicated to me. And I think it's partially because of the dispersal issue. So much of what happens in fragmented landscape is determined by this dispersal between the fragments, and dispersal in particularly the sea is a completely different can of worms. So I wouldn't want to expand to that. Yeah.
Another question that's quite different. You mentioned that you want to target like the target for each region. Do you develop any form of automated something like that?
No, I haven't developed it yet. So, and this is something that I'm kind of like wanting to move forward towards. So I think we can, so kind of like using that slide where I was showing that we can use these two different approaches to estimate kind of like how species are going to respond to habitat loss. I think we can, putting these sorts of information together, we could potentially predict the species, the thresholds in different parts of the world. I think the issue is that we're still trying to figure out how to best put this together, because that was kind of taken into account this concept that populations are more sensitive near the range edges. And we're still trying to figure out why that is, because so for instance, when we were doing these analyses, we kind of completely ignored the coastlines, because we had just assumed that if there was more habitat, further from the coastline the species would be there. And indeed, there is, like, if you measure distance to the coastline, then there isn't any effect of distance to range edges. So that suggests that it's really all to do with climate. So we're still trying to figure out what is it that it's driving this intraspecific variations in responses to habitat loss. It's probably climate, and it's probably something to do with biotic interactions that we don't understand, because that's really hard to measure and to predict as well. Yeah. Yes.
Most of the area thresholds are kind of two-dimensional. So, but we know that biodiversity is also an issue. So, what's going into like how that pleasant part threshold?
No. That's a very good question. I had not thought that much about elevation. We just, in a way, the way we're kind of incorporating a bit elevation is just by incorporating these sorts of temperature where the, you know, where the populations occur, and kind of like some populations are determined also by elevation. But no, I hadn't put elevation kind of quite directly into the models. No, that's a very good point. Thank you.
You know, if those relationships between community metrics and forest cover are consistent through time. I'm just asking this because I was mentally disturbed yesterday. Differently to the same gradient. Yeah, that's pretty difficult, isn't it? I don't know. I don't know if they're consistent through time. No. I think a lot of those studies were conducted over more than 1 year, though, which I think it's a little bit different to what Rob was showing yesterday. But I can't be sure. So one of the things that we're going to do, so Natasha, the student of mine, is going to do so she's going to look at the breeding bird survey results that we have all from the 80s moving, you know, now. So then we're going to look into temporal variation into of species responses and try to figure out a little bit better. But yeah, it's really complicated, and I can see that, you know, if it is the environment that's driving some species to be more sensitive and less sensitive, I can see how, you know, an El Nino year might just change everything, which is kind of what was shown. Rob might have shown yesterday, because I wasn't here, but I'm in that paper as well, so I should know. But yeah, I would think that basically the climate on that year and the environment and would affect deeply how species respond. And yeah, and you can see how also that could be driven by just food supply and, you know, interactions with other species and so forth. Yeah.
Can I ask you about 30% figure?
Yes, you can.
This is a cost benefit, right?
It is a cost benefit.
You've spoken a lot about the benefit.
What are the costs?
And well, I guess I've got two questions. The cost is based on restoration, so actually choosing species for planting them and looking after them, and that is high cost. So two questions is how do you choose the species to plant, and that clearly is going to have an impact on what you end up with in terms of the forest that's restored. And the second question, as a naive non-ecologist, wouldn't it be much less cost just to set aside the land and have succession take care of it?
Those are two very good questions. So I think so. The restoration part is very complicated, partially because of the nurseries. So I'm working with a reforestation company in the Amazon at the moment, and they are planting 64 species of native trees. And lots of them are kind of pioneer species, and some of them are just kind of species that
are there for, like, you know, what's it called, the Brazil nut, you know, so species that are going to take quite a while to grow and etc. But my understanding is that both for the Amazon and Atlantic forest, and I can imagine that that's going to be true for the whole world, a lot of the time the bottleneck is, do you have enough seedlings to plant, and also do you have enough land to buy and to do that? So these are two massive bottlenecks. Which is something that obviously, as there are more restoration companies working, then there should be, you know, that it should be driving more demand and, you know, supply and so forth. So whether that's going to be enough, I don't know. I'm not a restoration ecologist. And I know that there is a big field where people look into kind of like, you know, how many species you need to plant and all of that. Now, there are quite a few studies showing that if you just, you know, plant kind of like an island of trees, then, you know, mainly birds and bats will fly and then spread seeds around, and then things will come back. I suppose the problem is to which extent that habitat has been so heavily transformed that you have to do something. And that's particularly true in South America, where brachiara, which is a kind of like a grass from Africa, was planted, and it forms such a thick kind of bush that the seeds just fall on the top and they don't reach the ground. So you need to cut the brachiara. You need to kind of put a little bit of Roundup there, just to kind of, no, just joking, no, don't use it, just to kind of allow those seeds to reach the floor, the forest floor, or I mean the ground. There is an estimate of how many areas you would be able to restore just with passive restoration, which is do nothing, just kind of, you know, put a fence so the cows won't go there. But in the Atlantic forest, because the soil is quite poor and because, you know, that it's been used for such a long time, probably you still need to do some active restoration. But that's one of the reasons why we suggested starting from 20%, because if you start from 0% forest cover, then you have to do a lot of work to kind of restore that, and you're going to have to bring a lot of species back in. But if there's already 20% in the landscape, and if you're bringing it back to 30%, then the kind of cost benefit may be quite high. And then once you've done all those areas, you can move to other areas that, you know, are then 20%. So it's kind of doing it little by little. Yeah?
Just had a question related to the aquatic ecosystems related to these areas, forested areas. Do you have any idea how they get affected for all of this you say, or is there any studies going on about them?
I don't know. I don't really look much into the fresh, you mean the freshwater systems, right? No. At least the law that was passed in Rio de Janeiro, that was very much a protection of watersheds, and I wonder whether they would have some results by now, if they were monitoring at all. But the whole point was really kind of trying to maintain particularly the small streams and kind of, you know, from drying out. But I don't know, we don't have any evidence from that. So in this new work that we're going to be doing, that we're doing with this reforestation company in the Amazon, so we will be monitoring vertebrates and you know, aquatic life, and then we'll see how that's changing. But no, I don't have that much information. Yeah, it's very much terrestrial.
Science and started saying the policy is about being simple and reachable. So how would you like to see your research translated to the policy?
Yeah, so I think as you said, it's, you know, it needs to be simple, but people need to see that it is effective. I think that's the main problem. Like, you know, if you're, I don't know, for instance, speed limits, right? It's something that we all have an opinion about it. But if we see very clearly that if you reduce the speed limit, these many people are not going to die anymore, then you think, okay, so maybe that's fine. But if it doesn't change anything, then you're just annoyed because you want to go faster, sort of. So I think what I would like is to move forward towards kind of trying to implement this more tailored approach, where in different areas you would really be able to kind of do an assessment of how much is needed and then implement that. Because otherwise, if we say, if we come to New Zealand and say, well, you need 30%, but actually you need 50 and 30% is not going to do anything, then it's not going to have also the appeal, you know, at the end that it would have if you went for a larger amount. But it also, it's the other way around. So in some areas, maybe that you don't need that much, you need less. So I think it is just allowing different areas to choose or to define what is that works for them. I think that's probably going to be the best. And I don't know, I mean, it's hard to know how we can go anywhere and say, well, actually, you're going to need 74%. You know, it's going to be tough. But if that's the reality, that's what can we do? You know, if that's what we need. It is a very hard pill to swallow, but it is true. So I don't know. I don't know. I'm not into I don't know how to work the psychology of it to say, well, you know, we need 74%, but let's just go for 30. That should be fine. I don't know how that works. But what I do know is that at least in the Atlantic forest, it worked because people saw the evidence. And I think if we just say, well, let's use 30% everywhere, I don't know whether it would convince people all over the world to just use that 30% without necessarily knowing if it's going to be effective or not.
We're a few minutes over. I'm going to go with one more question from online.
Yes.
Your study implies that those places that are exposed to frequent disturbance, fires, storms, etc., lead to species which are more resilient. New Zealand, as you pointed out, is one of those places, one of these places. Perceived wisdom is that New Zealand species are very vulnerable rather than resilient. These comments, perhaps we are different. This is from Lee Walker.
Right. So I suppose it depends on the comparison, isn't it? Resilient compared to what? Is it more resilient than compared to Amazon species? Maybe not. So it's so for instance, I can talk a little bit about, again, the perception of it from the Atlantic forest side. So when Brazil was colonized by European settlers, they first arrived in the Northeast. So those areas have been transformed for like 500 years. And there are some incredibly sensitive species there, you know, that survive in kind of like tiny little patches of forest. And there is this, if you look up on the you know, a lot of the research around, you're going to go like, oh my God, the species X is so sensitive. It's just, you know, just got one patch of forest. Oh my God. So I'm not saying it's not true. That species is very sensitive, but there's like 3 or 4. While the rest of the 90% of the community couldn't care less. So then if you go to other parts of the Atlantic forest, then the proportion of the community is just much more sensitive. And you've got hundreds of species that are really, really sensitive. And they're only there because there's still some forest left. So, I honestly don't know much about New Zealand wildlife. But you know, so how many species of native birds are in New Zealand?
Not a question for me. Anyone?
Anyone? it's not many, right? So it is possible that the ones that were even more sensitive have gone extinct through time. So we like I don't know, is it 20, 30, 50 sort of thing? Kind of like that, right? So it is possible that at some point there were hundreds of species, 150, but those got extinct. So we don't know. We don't know that whether the current species, they are still sensitive, but they're just less sensitive than the ones that were here before. Yeah.
Back to kind of things like storms, fires in New Zealand, obviously had no mammal, and so it's like an every day, so like a storm every day, fire.
Yes. It will definitely, it probably would. Well, the storms, I mean, they will come and kind of clear a big area, right? So the species just need to be able to kind of disperse a lot. So it's a lot to do with dispersal. So imagine, like, if you think, for instance, you know, what happened in Canada, that like, or you know, North America and good parts of Europe, that you know, the entire areas got entirely covered by glaciers not a long time ago. You know, all of those areas had to be recolonized afterwards, isn't it? So you can see how the communities there, like probably just species that are a bit, you know, find it easier to disperse and all of that. So with New Zealand being an island, no mammals, I really don't know. Like, I think it is a little bit more complicated.
Richard online says a couple of hundred birds, of which many are extinct. So.
Yeah. So it is quite possible that a lot of species just have already gone extinct.
Not so happy notes. We're well over time, but I think that's actually a good sign. Everyone's really keen to
Thank
stay.
you.
Nobody's got classes to go to. That's a good thing. Got more questions, but let's stop.
I'm happy to continue here
Yeah.
talking to people afterwards.
That's probably there you go.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone wants to stay, there's more food at the back. Yeah, we might even some more coffee. And please do stay, but more importantly, join me in thanking Chris for a wonderful talk to us today, and really appreciate you coming.
Thank you. De nada. Obrigada.
Thanks everyone online too for joining us.